Welcome to Learn at Lunchtime. I am Sherry Trimble, one of the museum educators at the State Museum. Today we're doing things a little differently. We have done a recorded session because we have two special interviews that we've brought in that are going to be working in conjunction with a new exhibit that's going to be opening at the State Museum on September 9th in remembrance of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 events. Today, I'd like to introduce Beth Hager, the director at the State Museum, and she'll introduce our presenters.
Hi, I'm Beth Hager. I'm director of the State Museum of Pennsylvania in Harrisburg, and I want to thank you for joining us today for State Museum Perspectives. On 9/11 this year, it will have been 20 years since the attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the crash of United Airlines Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The State Museum and State Archives have collaborated on a special exhibit commemorating 9/11 using some special collections from the State Archives. We'll talk more about that later and our special collaboration with WITF to create media for the exhibit. But first, I'd like to introduce my guests who are on screen with me right now. We have WITF's Multimedia News Director and Morning Edition host, Tim Lambert. The earphones at WITF, and National Public Radio's White House Correspondent, Scott Detrow.
Hey.
Well, he's kind of to my right.
Virtually.
Virtually. Scott and Tim have teamed up this summer to produce a special program for NPR's Politics podcast on the legacy of Flight 93. But they're not strangers, they are colleagues. Tim joined WITF shortly before 9/11, 20 years ago, and Scott worked at WITF as State Capitol Bureau Chief for several years before joining NPR in 2015. They are both national award-winning journalists. Thank you both very much for joining us for State Museum Perspectives. It's a real honor to have you.
My pleasure.
It's good to be here. I love the State Museum.
Great. Oh, thank you. Great. Tim, I wanted to talk to you first. You've been covering the Flight 93 story for 20 years now, but you also have a really unique connection to Flight 93. Why don't you tell us about that to start off our talk?
Sure. I think this is probably the longest I've ever paid attention to one story over the course of my career, basically at WITF. So my family owned a portion of the crash site of Flight 93 in Stony Creek Township outside Shanksville.
That is incredible. Do you remember going to the site right afterwards, or how soon was it that you got to the crash site?
It was a little complicated because I hadn't been to the site since I was a kid. My grandparents passed away. I think my grandmother passed away in the 80s. So, you know, we sold her house and we had really no reason to go to Shanksville anymore. But we had this piece of land, about 164 acres outside Shanksville, that we just held on to. So I kind of forgot about it, except, you know, when my dad signed it over to me in the early 90s, and then, you know, when the tax bill came for the property taxes. But on 9/11, when I first heard about the crash in Shanksville, I thought, you know, my dad's from there. He might know some people that know where this happened, who might have witnessed it, who might know anything that's going on. And then as the day wore on, some of the national television reporters were reporting from this intersection, the Shanksville-Lambertsville Road. And it caused me to stop in my tracks at one point and think, wow, oh yeah, we own land there, and that's really close to it. Like, that clicked in my brain. And then when I got home on September 12th at about 1:30 in the morning, I had an answering machine message from my dad, and he basically said, you know, if you've seen the video, those are our trees in the background. Those are our trees. So he said, what do we do next? And we kind of thought, well, they're busy. They'll find us when they need us. And it was about 3 or 4 weeks later when the Somerset County coroner, Wallace Miller, called me and confirmed that those indeed were our trees. And he invited me to come to the site and take a look around. At that point, I told him I was a journalist, and he said, and Wally's so awesome. He said, what are you going to do? Report on yourself? And I said, I don't know yet. This is kind of uncharted territory. So he was kind enough to allow me to bring an audio recorder and a camera and a couple of people with me. And we first toured the site, I think, that first Saturday in October 2001. So that was the first time I had actually been to the site after Flight 93 crashed.
Were recovery efforts still going on at that point? Did you get to see some of that happening?
Yeah, it was cleanup efforts at that point. So I guess Wally on a Saturday had been, supervising some teams of folks going through the woods with hard hats on and carrying plastic buckets, picking up debris that was still there. So, it was this place that, I couldn't tell was the one that I had visited as a kid. It was barren now. Burned trees were piled up. Bulldozers were there. And then there was just, debris of Flight 93 all around us as we walked around the site. So, it was a really humbling experience to be there at that point in time. And you could still smell the jet fuel when the wind kicked up, which was, stunning to us.
Well, one of the things as we have prepared for the exhibit, and I did not realize this, that the imprint of the crash scene was really rather small. I mean, I know that there were things spread out, but the point of impact was very direct and very, I know there were people who say they didn't see anything. They expected to see more when they got out there. Was that
Yeah.
your
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way it was described to me was it came in at about 563 miles an hour, which is extremely rare for an aviation crash at that speed. They're usually at takeoff or landing. It came in upside down as it kind of plummeted to the earth. The first class section in the cockpit broke off when it struck the ground and kind of exploded into the tree line, which is when you see those pictures of the burnt trees, that absorbed that initial blast. And then the plane sort of telescoped right onto itself and exploded into all these pieces. And, we didn't really realize what we were looking at until Wally picked up a piece of debris and said, this is what we've been recovering. And it was like a camera shutter clicked. And all of a sudden, that's all we could see was metal and insulation and wiring, lots of wiring. And it was just everywhere on the ground.
And that was one of the most striking things as we interviewed people, as we went through oral histories and kind of tried to reconstruct those first few days and weeks at the site. How many people, even trained first responders, showed up to the site and just were confused at first, saying, well, wait a second, where's the plane crash? I don't see any obvious signs of a plane crash. It was just the brutal impact in the particular type of land that it crashed into, that reclaimed strip mine, just led to this unique scattering of the plane into millions and millions of pieces that, are still showing up 2 decades later.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tim, you quickly started reporting and covering the site, covering the story. I will ask Scott, you came about a decade after 9/11, and when did you first hear about Tim's connection, and what intrigued you about it at that time?
It was, I think it was actually one of our very first conversations ever. We were trying to reconstruct this because I came to WITF in fall of 2007. And that's right when Tim had won a national award for a story he did on the 5th anniversary of the attacks. And I think it was just, he was off to go to New York to get it. And he explained it to me. He said, yeah, in fact, the plane crashed on my land. So, right off the bat, that's a good introduction to Tim because it's such an important part of his life. And then as our Capitol reporter, I started covering Flight 93. There were so many incremental things happening at that point in time, the negotiations over purchasing the property to build the memorial. Then there was the groundbreaking for the memorial. A couple years later in 2011, I remember when Osama bin Laden was killed, in the middle of the night, that Sunday night, Tim and I having a conversation. He said, yeah, I think you need to get into a car right now and drive out to the site so you can be there in the morning when people start showing up. So I kind of it became a story that I covered a lot over the years too when I was at WITF. And Tim took me down to see the site itself, and I think it was the spring of 2008. We were out in Western Pennsylvania for work, and he asked me if I wanted to see it. And one of the things I've been thinking about as we work on this project is that at that point in time, 9/11 felt so far away. It felt so far removed. And the idea that there were still pieces of wire in the ground 7 years later was just unfathomable to me. And here we are 20 years later, and 2008 itself seems like ancient history.
Mhm. It does. I want to go back to Tim, his reporting in the first decade. Tim, you got very close to a number of the family members and next of kin. How did you gain their trust? This is such a beyond personal story. How did you connect with them, and I know there are connections you still have to this day.
It was a complicated situation, I think, being a journalist and being a landowner, sort of being this caretaker of the property where their loved ones lost their lives. That was now a cemetery, essentially. So I also had a perspective from I guess a historic perspective. I had lived and worked in Gettysburg for 7 years, and in fact, I was living in Gettysburg when 9/11 happened. So I sort of had always this interest in history, and I knew how the Park Service would operate as well. I sort of was up close and personal with them through some major stories in Gettysburg. So I had this sort of sense of the historic nature of what was happening. But when it came to the families, it really boiled down to, for me and my family, was that whatever they wanted to do, whenever they wanted to go to that site, they could, as far as we were concerned. And whatever they wanted for that site to be and become we wanted to do as much as we could to make that happen. So it just was really a case of sometimes just going out to the site myself, and all of a sudden Wally would pull up in his truck, and behind him would be a couple of cars, and I'd realize it was a family member he was bringing out there, and I didn't know if it was the first time they were ever there or not. So I tried to get out of there as quickly as possible, but Wally would call me over and introduce me, and so that's how I got to know some of the families. And then just by my friendship that grew with Wally over the years, he trusted me enough to invite me along to a family meeting he held in February of 2002. That was really unprecedented in its nature, where he got the families together to sort of talk about the investigation and explain to them what they were going to be receiving in terms of remains and personal effects. So that's where I was able to meet several family members there, including Debbie Porza, who was a source that I have chatted with throughout the years and who has surfaced in a lot of our reporting and will in the piece Scott and I are working on. Mm-hmm. And then it was just spending time at the site, and the families would be down there, or events, commemorations, the anniversaries. And we just, when you're in that site and you're talking about what happened there, you just feel the power, the presence of it. And it just is so much more solemn to be in there and come across a plane part while you're talking to somebody whose loved one was on that plane. And so it just became this bond between everyone who was involved in Flight 93, I think, at that point.
Mm-hmm. So looking at your podcast project this summer, what were your goals for this project in terms of, how has the story not really evolved, but what new perspectives have been gained, and what were you really looking to do with this project this summer?
I'll let Scott take that one, because I'm a little biased, so I'll wait and see what he says.
It was challenging at first, because I think we knew we wanted to tell this 20-year story. Tim and I had talked for years about doing some sort of big picture, as definitive as we could be, look at this 20-year history around this anniversary, and I'm really glad we were able to do it. There's several things at once. First of all, it's just telling the personal story that Tim had, this unique perspective. I don't think any journalist in the country had this type of angle into 9/11 in the way that it directly affected his life, the way that he was able to build these relationships. And when Tim talks about getting to know these family members, I saw it so many times this summer where, I think over time, I hope I kind of gained some of their trust a little bit, but it was just nowhere near the level that Tim had, where I would ask a question at first and I would get what kind of seemed like the answer that a lot of these family members have been giving reporters for 20 years. Then Tim would ask a question, and their entire demeanor would change, because this is someone they know and trust and view as part of this community that has been established in Shanksville over the years. So we wanted to tell Tim's personal story. We wanted to tell the story of what it's like to cope with this unimaginable grief for 20 years, how that changes over time, how that doesn't change over time. And the story of how this community has developed at what is now the National Memorial, but for many years was just a crash site, was just a recovery site, even when the land was still scarred, even when there weren't wildflowers like there are today. Family members were able to meet each other there. They were able to build a community with each other, with people experiencing the shared grief, and they were able to find some sort of peace and solace there. So those are all the things that we're trying to tell in this podcast piece, which it posts a week from today, and then it'll be on WITF and other public radio stations a little closer to 9/11.
Yeah, and I think it was important to tell the story of the family's journey. I think one of the things about Flight 93, it sort of has become this footnote in the entire fabric of 9/11. It's the attacks in Washington and New York, and then this field in Pennsylvania. And it remained this mysterious place because nobody was able to visit it. Nobody was able to get down into those woods, into that field. So everybody's impression of it came from either the photos of the burning crater, the charred crater, or they were at a respectful distance of 300 yards maybe and looking out into the trees. And now there's a boulder there. It used to be a security fence with a flag that they would be able to say, oh, that's where the crash happened. So I think the story of the site itself is one that needed to be told, and how that site sort of went from this reclaimed strip mine and this kind of family-owned property with cabins in the woodland and the hemlock trees, to this horrible disaster, and then to a cemetery, and then to this place that became important to the families where they felt the need to be there, and now is a national memorial. So, their relationship with the site itself, I think, is kind of, an emotion that runs through this entire piece that Scott and I are working on.
Mm-hmm. Well, I myself had not been to the memorial until just a few months ago. Our exhibit team went out in May in preparation for getting in the right frame of mind for the exhibit, and I just was blown away by everything that you said about the site. It's so careful, it's beautiful, but it's so solemn. While I was standing down in the lower part near the crash site, a woman, it's like people were so really moved by this that they were talking to each other. And a woman came up to me, she just turned and she said, "This is profound." And that's the word that for the whole memorial, how the building is designed, the flight path denoted, everything. It's just such a moving experience. And so, I can't encourage people enough to go out there and see this. What are some of your thoughts about the memorial itself today?
I mean, that's a good way to put it. And I think the almost minimalist way that it's built and the way that it blends into nature, I think makes it so moving. I think another thing that's really moving and profound, like you said about it, is the story itself. And I've been thinking a lot about how the idea of unity feels very far off for 1,000 different reasons in 2021. But this is a story of 40 strangers banding together. And I think the thing that people don't fully understand is how short the time window was for this. The first phone call is made at 9:35. By 9:44, they have a plan together. They've come up with a plan. They voted on that plan, and they start to execute that plan. Imagine we can't even agree with whether to wear masks on airplanes right now, right? Or whether or not to yell at the flight attendants. It's just like the discord and the inability to get along. On airplanes more than any other place in our current society. But these are people, and horrible violence has already taken place. The plane is falling from the sky. This is the most terrifying situation you could ever think of. And yet they were able to come up to work together, and they were able to succeed in one sense where the United States Capitol was not destroyed. The White House, it was most likely the Capitol. It's an open question still, probably the Capitol. That building still stands because they were able to work together and get to the same page. And I think that's that's such a moving thing. That's so hard to get your head around of how could you react in a similar situation, and to be able to think about that, looking out in that field with those marble walls and the overlook. I think it's a really special place.
It is a National Park Service site, as we were saying. The introductory brochure that everyone receives or can receive when they go to their museum, which is very well done, very moving as well, inside the memorial. One side it says Flight 93, and I think it shows the landscape. You flip it over, and there's this beautiful full-scale picture of the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol. You know, and that it just brings home so much what the devastation. You know, there's enough, more than enough devastation that day, but that one further symbol that could have been taken from us on that day, and
Yeah,
it's so amazing. What I wanted to ask you also is, you know, this again is one of those tragic touch points in American history. Pearl Harbor, JFK assassination, 9/11. How do you, though, there are a lot of people have memories about 9/11, but a number of people don't. You know,
Yeah.
now you can be 20 years old, you could be 23 years old probably and not remember it. How do you connect this story to people who don't have memories of 9/11 today?
I think it goes back to what Scott touched on there. I mean, we all travel, we all get on a plane. We go through that mundane process of going through security. We're annoyed by having to take off our belt and shoes. We wait, we're kind of shuffled like cattle through the gates and onto the plane, and you're squished in. And then you look around and you're like, oh, I don't have any room. This is a mess. I'm hungry. When am I going to get something to drink? So you have all these like ridiculous thoughts, and you sort of zone out a little bit. And then when you think about, like Scott said, you have this short period of time where the worst thing in the world is happening to you. Um, the passengers and crew had a 25-minute window, I think, because the plane was delayed on the tarmac, which allowed them to find out that this wasn't a typical hijacking that we thought of pre 9/11. This was a flying missile at this point. And they kind of figured it was bleak and they had to do something. So in that short period of time, they gathered the intelligence they needed. They did the most American thing possible by voting on it. Different races, colors, creeds, income levels, ages, from 20 to 79. And they came together and did something amazing. And I think that's the story that people need to remember. And that's the story that needs to be told to generations moving forward. That day could have been so much darker if the Capitol would have been destroyed, if more lives would have been lost in Washington. Yet another symbol of this country, from military strength to financial strength, and then the symbol of democracy itself. I mean, that would have been a tough blow for this country to absorb. So, you know, the 40 people on that plane are heroes, and what they did was extraordinary. And when you stand in them at that memorial and you look out in the field, I think the question that comes to everybody is, would I do what they did? Could I do what they did? And I think that's as powerful a thing that you can think about, have that introspection as you can have.
Mhm. Well,
And you know, just very quickly add, we were really mindful that it's been 20 years and there's a lot of people with no memory or a very dim memory, like you said. The NPR Politics podcast has a really young listening audience. We have a ton of people in high school, a ton of people in their 20s who listen to this podcast. So we made sure we needed to tell the full story of what actually happened on September 11th on the flight. We couldn't just shorthand it and assume that people knew, because I think a lot of people might only know one or two sentences about that. So, you know, I hope that if people listen to this podcast and get that full story, that's a pretty successful mark for me.
Well, I'm really going to look forward to seeing that next week. Let's turn to another project that Tim and the State Museum, State Archives have worked on, collaborated for our special exhibit. The State Archives received notes, field notes, quickly written on the morning of 9/11 from Colonel Paul Ivanko. He was the head of the state police on September 11th, 2001. And he was receiving information all morning. and then ended up being taking Governor Ridge out to the site via helicopter late in the day for a press conference. We have his notes. That's what we're displaying. But Tim and his colleagues at WITF worked with us to conduct a special interview of Colonel Ivanko at the State Museum. I'd like to play a clip from that interview quickly. It's about a minute long, and we can talk about it briefly after that.
I was taking care of trying to get the governor back to Pennsylvania, find the lieutenant governor, make arrangements to get him back. So my time was tied up right then and there in getting the governor back to Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, by that time, the ban on air travel was in effect. Nobody was going anywhere. The military said nobody flies, and they were serious about it. I'll tell you how serious they were. When we finally, after 3 hours, got authorization to take him by a military helicopter to the site, we're flying along. Now we have authorization, and I'm looking out the corner of my eye, and I thought I saw a movement. And I know there's not supposed to be anybody up there. And I look again, and here's a fighter jet right off the left side of our helicopter. And a second later, there's another fighter jet. So they're right beside us. They're looking us over to make sure we're who we said we were. And with that, they went poof, and they were going. So that was a little, I don't know how you describe something like that, because you know, you're looking at these things, you know what they're capable of doing.
I should mention also through the Zoom cast, it's a little fits and starts there, but it will be smooth in the exhibit. We have about a 14-minute piece in the exhibit. I know WITF is going to air, I think, a video postcard, a shorter piece at different times. But Tim, you did an hour-long interview with Colonel Ivanko at the museum. Thank you. We really enjoyed working with you. What did you glean? I mean, I thought it was incredibly compelling, a lot of his remembrances from that day. What struck you?
Yeah, I want to thank you for the opportunity to sit down and talk to him, because to me, it was how organized the response was. You know, again, the chaos of 9/11, I don't think anyone really sat back and thought, wow, how did the state police handle this massive story, this massive law enforcement response? And to hear him talk about right away, he was thinking about securing the tunnels on the turnpike, securing the nuclear power plants, the 6 nuclear power plants in Pennsylvania, how he was in touch with the National Guard, and how the Ridge administration was following this closely, and how quickly they got the governor from Erie back to Harrisburg, then to Shanksville. And just the immense manpower that the state police poured into that investigation at the Flight 93 crash site, working with local officials like Wally Miller, and working with federal officials like the FBI, the NTSB, you know, United. It just was this massive effort. And it brought home to me, someone who had walked the site with Wally, and I remember distinctly, as he pointed out, areas that were campfires. And he said, yeah, the state police, sometimes some of the troopers spent the night in the woods, and they built these campfires because, you know, it gets pretty cold at that site. So to hear that response, and to hear how much manpower was put into it, you know, was some insight and a perspective that I just never had, just because 9/11 in 2001, the coverage that we had was just, you just never knew what was going to happen next. So you never could take that step back and take that 30,000-foot view. So that to me was amazing, and was a wonderful opportunity to hear exactly how that played out in terms of the state police response.
Mm-hmm. It really gives you that perspective, as you say, of the hundreds of people who were involved with, you know, the crash, the cleanup, the recovery.
I was going to say there were probably more troopers at that site than many state barracks are staffed across the state. So that was another thing that I think was pretty overwhelming to hear.
many other organizations. And he also talked about how all of these different agencies got along so well and coordinated so well, came together to do what they had to do at the site. It was a very interesting interview. It's something that you can see at the exhibit. Should mention also again, the exhibit opens on September 9th. That's a Thursday, 2 days before September 11th. We're very pleased that Smart Talk is going to have a live broadcast from the museum that morning at 9 a.m. So that will essentially open the exhibit on September 9th. And we'll share with you at the end of this broadcast a site where you can sign up to join us live in the auditorium. And then, of course, regardless, tune in that morning. It'll be very good because Colonel Ivanka is going to be interviewed in person, as well as our state archivist, David Carmichael, and several other guests. So we're looking forward to that. And the exhibit is on display through January 2nd, 2022. So we look forward to that. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for joining us and giving us this inside look at your podcast production and just really your heartfelt comments about this anniversary, this 20th anniversary, and all the work that you've put into it. And I really salute you for that as well. And the work you've done for years to cover this story and commemorate and honor those who died on 9/11.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And it was good to be here today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Always appreciate the opportunity to talk about Flight 93.